I have a memory as a child sitting down at the table with my grandmother Saturday morning or other, and I was working on a scramble from the papers. It's a game where you'll be given 4 words, 2 5 letters, 2 6, and they're all jumbled up. And after you solve those words, you unscramble them. You'll take a handful of letters from each word to solve a larger riddle, which is usually a play on words. And I was working at it, sitting at the table, grandmother right next to me, working on who knows what, reading the news or whatnot. And I was trying to figure it out, and I thought each one would be, you write out, okay, it could be this, you try this, you switch the vowels around, trying to figure out where to place those, and then finally, and it was taking forever, and I was kind of going on and on and on, trying to figure out back and forth, trying to spell this word half a dozen times, and then finally, I solved one. I was really young, and I was really bad at it, but I solved one word in the scramble, and it was a great moment. I was so happy, I was so proud of myself, and looking back at this, you can easily see that what made it memorable is the fact that it took me so long, the fact that I struggled, the fact that it wasn't easy, the fact that I barely made it because I was really, really close at giving up. I came close to solving it and came close to giving up a number of times, but then you solve it and it makes it all the better. And for whatever reason, if you want to take this moment and kind of extrapolate from there, for whatever reason, people generally don't value things that just happen to them as much as if they earn it. This is true in your own life at various points. The first dollar you earn feels a lot different than your 500th salary or anything like that at your real job in the adult world. The monies, they feel different. There's a different weight to it, And so what I want to do is take this memory, take this moment, and remember this in relation to stories and how we treat the audience. We're going to cover these little moments and these little connections, little moments where the audience earns this solution to this mystery. And they make these connections that is not directly pointed out for them. And we're going to take a look at this in True Detective. And let's take a look at this conversation between Rust and this prostitute woman he's interviewing, trying to trace out and figure out what happened to one of the victims in this case, a victim of this serial killer.
Kind of strange. Like you might be dangerous.
Of course I'm dangerous. I'm police. I can do terrible things to people with impunity.
And so that last comment ends, and then the scene changes to something else. Marty's off sleeping with another woman. Him and Marty have a fight. They kind of have this ongoing dialogue. There's a break, and then you have this moment with Russ that comes up.
I'll be right back.
It's my bad, boys. Maybe we got started on the wrong foot there.
You remember where that little whorehouse is, huh?
This is a classic setup and follow through. They kind of set something up and then tee it up and then knock it out of the park, but it's not pointed out to us. Honestly, it's not something that's even really required or important to the story, but what it does is it adds this depth to the characters and this depth to the story, and also we feel smarter for having made this connection because there wasn't anyone staring at the camera that, looks and goes, I'm the character that explains what's happening and here's the connection from there. It's letting us figure it out from there. And it really, really makes the story feel that much richer. And so let's take a look at another one. We see another thing play into effect where you can see the reasons characters might do things is a little bit, and their reactions is a little bit explained by these little moments.
I want to ask y'all something. Y'all think maybe this have something to do with those cats?
What cats?
2 of them. One, and a couple of weeks later, another. Somebody caught them up, turned the insides out, and nailed them to the front door twice. Now, I called and told the police, but we're predominantly African-American congregation. I asked for it to be investigated.
And so there's a time gap, we're going to other scenes, they're taking a look at this, and then we go later to the precinct, back at the police force, where suddenly this mention of animals, what happens to the animals, comes back.
Majors introduced me. New flying squad.
We've been tasked with investigating crimes with possible occult links. There's been a rash of animal mutilations, cemeteries defiled.
And they want to see what we have on the Lane case.
Uh-huh. Well, this task force is important to the commander and to the governor's office.
And when you hear the task force talking about this, the alarm bells start going off, and we instantly understand why Rust is against the task force. He doesn't want them anywhere near the case. He never actually explicitly specifies it at this point. and neither does Marty. But if you caught this little, this little mention, you understand that there's something fishy, something's going on. And this immediately builds into the greater conspiracy that Russ is completely convinced is real. And we can kind of see that, okay, you guys didn't care about this before and you do now. What's changed? And you realize, okay, there's something going on. This is such a good moment, and all these little things matter so much because the story treats the audience as intelligence. It doesn't give us a clear or obvious commentary telling us whether it's true or not, or making this. It lets us watch the show and see what's true and try to make sense of the story and a character as it unfolds for us. And as we're going through this, down in the comments, let me know what stories or moments you noticed or loved in True Detective or any other shows, stories. There's a lot of examples. Westworld is chock full of these, where it's like these little bitty moments and side comments that really have a much greater payoff, and the story feels that much more deep and richer if you pay attention and connect the dots from there. And these moments you have in stories mean so much more when it really feels like you've earned it. When you reach the end of a story, after this long journey, you see the climax, you see the characters fall in love, the villain be killed, they reach the goal, discover whatever. It feels valuable and you value it more. This makes sense. It's obvious. It's why you can't skip to the end of a story and feel the same as if you watch the characters all the way through. You have to live through the failures to really feel the triumphs. In True Detective, what we have two main timelines to follow. You have this past, some 20 years ago, and then the present, where we're conducting these interviews. And by jumping in between the two, you're able to make it feel like some time's past, cut out the boring parts. Russ and Marty drive somewhere, cut to the present. They'll have some interview, they'll talk about it, and they'll cut back to the past. They've arrived, and now they're interviewing some people from there. And it's able to, get this sense of time going. And you're also able to build mystery. It's a great technique, and a lot of places will do that. And you have two mysteries to build towards. What happens in the past, what's going to happen in the present, And it's clear from the second episode onward that the two detectives are re-examining the case, are, very interested in Rust in particular. Why? It's not immediately answered. We can guess, but we want to know more. The story doesn't tell us, so we have to ask. And all of this does is give us a lot of potential information to the audience. It's key not to spoon feed the audience. We want to feel smart. We want to figure it out. Our minds naturally are starting to trying to find a pattern. We want to give in all the pieces of information and put them together ourselves alongside the main character even before. You don't want to immediately know, the Sixth Sense, where everything, there's the big twist at the end. If you figure it out at the very beginning, it's kind of a boring movie. The whole point is that you have just enough information so where you don't figure it out. But then as you piece it together, it's just this mind-blowing moment where it all comes together. You have this moment of understanding what's going from here. In the beginning, even for True Detective, we don't even know why the two detectives are interviewing Russ and Marty. Let's take think of that. And then let's compare it with a scene from another movie, where it's like, why is this character here? What are we doing here? What's going on? And let's, compare how these two handle it.
Right. Come here.
I can't.
This is why we're here. Unobtainium. Because this little gray rock sells for 20 million a kilo. That's the only reason. It's what pays for the whole party. It's what pays for your science. Comprendo? Now those savages are threatening our whole operation. We're on the brink of war, and you're supposed to be finding a diplomatic solution. So use what you've got and get me some results.
And while it's good to inform the audience, you want them to understand what's happening. You don't want them to completely be lost. But exposition-wise, it doesn't really make sense. The lady's been there for years. She knows why she's here. The guy explaining it is dumb. We kind of don't really like him. He's supposed to be smarmy. But all this scene does is very clearly articulate out why we're here, what we're doing. It's something that you typically would put in an email for work. It's not very interesting or not very engaging, And by contrast, True Detective is giving you these little pieces, what it does. And what this does is it keeps the audience engaged. If they don't know what's important to the case, then they'll pay attention to everything,
You mow my lawn?
There's all these funny scenes in the story where it's just, these are kind of inane scenes that give you more depth about characters, but they don't really, they're kind of inane.
I just don't ever want you mowing my lawn, all right? I like mowing my lawn.
vacuum. You watch it out of context, and it's kind of like, why are we here? What brings us here? We'll watch anything, because we're trying to figure out and piece together all the information between these characters and between the plot, greater plot, and what's going on. You'll watch two grown men argue about who mows a lawn. And on the flip side, what it looks like if you try and handhold the audience is that you're telling us, it really just communicates that this is a simple plot. This can work. You can find ways to make it work. You can build it and go, listen, it's very straightforward, but what we're doing is something else. Saving Private Ryan. We're here to save Private Ryan. Bam. Simple, fairly simple, but then the depth comes out from there. It's not as straightforward as we thought from there, but you don't really want to have somebody look at the audience from here and say, this is all you need to pay attention to. You want the audience to pay attention to everything because you want the level of understanding to be much higher than the audience is expecting, so they're starting to pay attention to everything. They're starting to care. They're getting invested. They don't have some sort of assurance that there's going to be a character who just looks at the camera or looks at another character who's the exposition character who's like, wait, we're doing this because of X and Y, so we can do this with that and the other. It's very, very clearly laid out.
Oh, right. The poison for Cusco. The poison chosen specially to kill Cusco. Cusco's poison. Fat poison?
Yes, fat poison.
Got you covered.
And as the audience, we want to feel smart. We want to figure it out. We don't want to be told what to think. We want to be given the pieces to fit it all together and go, okay, I don't like him. And so this situation, this character does that and this, and there's a challenge to it. There's an engagement part where if you figure it out yourself, you value it more. You begin to be invested more. And that's when you get the audience pulled into your story to such a greater deal. These why episodes are ending on a cliffhanger because you have all these questions and suddenly they throw out this grand new question for you. You want to know the answer and you'll dangle the promise of the answer in front of them and you want to follow. You want to watch the next episode to the next episode to the next episode and figure out where it leads.
Inside on the floor on the right.
And all these moments, these little connections that the story doesn't tell you, but lets you make the connections yourselves, make them more valuable. You want to be smart. There's a mutual respect. The story trusts the audience to be smart. And in turn, when the audience connects these pieces, they value the story more. It adds to the journey. For True Detective, all these little moments make watching it such a joy, but also rewatching it. You can solve everything on the first watch through, then it means the story isn't that deep oftentimes. You figured it out. There, you can move on to the next. But if you see all these moments begin making new connections, you get to experience new aspects of the story, even though you're watching it again. This is how stories and mysteries are built. It's why ends on a cliffhanger and all that from there. You have the scene where everything it sets up, and then you want a payoff, and the audience wants to be able to see how this plays in. Why are you showing this scene to me? What is going on? How does this play into the bigger picture?
You are a stranger to yourself, and yet he knows you. Yes, he does. And when your hard heart made you like unto the stone and broke you from his body, which is the stars and the wind between the stars, he knew you.
Transference of fear and self-loathing to an authoritarian vessel. It's catharsis. He absorbs their dread with his narrative. Because of this, he's effective in proportion to the amount of certainty he can project.
And so we take the scene from a preacher, and let's see then what happens next. Sometimes later, some time has passed, they're in a different spot, but now Russ is here talking to a suspect. Let's see how this interaction goes down.
Now, what you did is not your fault. It's not. I know these things, Chris.
I'm weak. I'm sick. I get to the houses and I can't leave until I go all over the drawers.
Listen to me, son. You got one way out, and it's through the grace of God. You are only as the Lord made you.
Please just tell me what to say. I want to confess. I want to confess.
And these details make figuring out Rust's characters and understanding him more a mystery of itself. Same with Marty. We want to know more. We want to see the pattern that makes him tick. Why he does this. What about his past? Why are the two detectives interested in him? What happened to the killer? All of these questions that the story doesn't answer. We're searching and scrounging for all these little bits of information because we're told we better be paying attention, because there's not somebody who's going to look at the camera and explain everything to it. I love Inception, but there's that one character, I think it's Ellen Page or whatever. I think that was it. And she's looking at the camera. Every single scene with her character is her looking and basically going, oh wait, so is this what happening right now? I have some sympathy because it is a fairly somewhat complicated plot, especially for the first watch through, but her character is useless largely if you rewatch it. You're just like, she just looks at there and goes, this is what's happening, right? And everybody goes, yes, of course that's what's happening. And it's inane. It doesn't really age well from there. And imagine if she didn't there, or imagine if she had an actual plot or character development in and of itself, independent from there. And the reason why these moments matter so much is because your story is going to be made up of these little moments no matter what, whether they connect or not. You only get so many big climactic moments that you can build for, the big reveal, the love, the hate, the villain, anything like that. And these little moments are what build up the story and make the most of the story, create these big moments. And if your audience doesn't stick around for the little moments, they'll never make it to the end. They'll never make it to the big climactic showdown, Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader, the charge of the Rohirrim, where you have King Theoden who has his last moment as he's charging forth, or anything like that. Aragorn is his moment where he takes the realm of King. Bilbo when he goes and faces Smaug, or anything like that. These little moments, the daily moments, the little connections help keep the audience engaged, and that makes them pay attention more. It also lets the rewatching make it such a richer experience, because you want to keep going back and forth and keep going back to find these little moments, because it's such a rich experience from there. So, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I am looking forward to doing some stuff on Andor next, because hopefully we'll get some episodes out here soon, so we can take a look at that and see what it is, and hopefully season 2 is just as good as season 1. But yeah, if you guys wouldn't mind, please like and subscribe. It definitely really helps out, and I do read all the comments, so please let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what your thoughts are. What little moments did you notice in this or anything else? And we'll go from there. I appreciate you guys. See you in the next one.